Glad that everyone here is assembled and ready for Bible study this morning. We certainly welcome each of you to the auditorium this morning, and we certainly want to welcome those who are joining us by way of live stream. It's been 2 weeks since we had this class in Daniel. Sorry about that. Thank you, Ned, for having a lesson, and then I guess I need to tell you that you'll be in service next week, as I'll be out of town, hopefully. Last time we met with regard to Daniel, we had the narrative of the handwriting on the wall, and we all know what that handwriting on the wall had to do with. We're going to finish that because we are in the 29th verse of the 5th chapter of Daniel. And then we're going to be going into the lion's den. Children in the church understand about the lion's den. There are a lot of nuances with regard to the lion's den that we want to talk about before we get into chapter 6. Before we start our class this morning, Don, would you word a prayer for us, please? So, in the 29th verse of the 5th chapter, 29th verse, 5th chapter of Daniel, we're finishing up the whole matter of the Babylonian Empire. Now, it's rather interesting that we have in our study, we have seen that Daniel was a government official from the time of the beginning of the Babylonian rule to the end of it. And not only that, he moved into the Medo-Persian rulership. Now, the transition from the Babylonian Empire to the Medo-Persian Empire seemed to me rather smooth. We have in our government we have a smooth transition from one president to another, but this seemed to be a kind of a smooth transition between the Babylonian rule and the Medo-Persian rule. At least it doesn't reveal that there was a lot of bloodshed connected with that. It was kind of an interesting, to me, it was kind of an interesting transition. Now, Daniel, for whatever reason, was absorbed into the Medo-Persian government. It was just very interesting. He was given a commission by the outgoing Belshazzar. Belshazzar, he was given that, he was made the third ruler in the kingdom of Babylon. But then when the Medo-Persian people came along, when Darius came along, he was there in government. So, it wasn't as if the Medes, the Persians, wasn't as if Darius just purged the old leadership. At least Daniel was, carried over. To me, that's a fascinating situation. Now, Belshazzar, of course, was the last king of the Babylonian regime. He was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar ruled how many years? Over 40 years. So he ruled a major portion of the time that the Babylonian Empire was in existence. And of course, Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar, it seemed to me that they were on friendly terms throughout Nebuchadnezzar's reign. And he then was carried over into Nebuchadnezzar's, that is, Daniel was carried over into Nebuchadnezzar's, from Nebuchadnezzar's reign to his son's reign and to the reign of the grandson, Belshazzar. Persia was, and I don't understand, much about that, the Old Testament history there, but Persia was a greater empire in terms of territory and rulership than the Babylonian Empire. Darius was the first, ruler, and there was seemed to be some relationship, some physical relationship, that is, a relationship due to bloodline between Darius and Cyrus. Now, you remember that Cyrus was the king that released the Jews, right? And helped them build the temple and so on. So Darius was in authority for a while, and then the rulership was passed on to Cyrus. But Persia was an empire that spanned, according to the book of Esther, over 120 or so provinces. Now, that means that there were, 120 of those provinces. Each province had been a former self-ruling operation. That is, it was a former. There were a former solvency, and so the Persian Empire, took over the governments of all those territories. Now, it's kind of interesting that, and this is embedded in Daniel if we really look at it. There was each of those provinces, and it was an expansive territory. Each of them had a ruler. One of the people that were involved in that, in that previously sovereign nation, each of them had a civil ruler. Now, when the central government of the Persians took over, what they wanted was the tax money. I mean, that's what they wanted. We think Washington wants tax money. Well, Washington gets it, but here, this central rulership, they wanted lots of tax money. And that civil ruler that was appointed was responsible for getting that tax money to Darius and Cyrus, the central government. But each of those provinces had a military ruler. Now, you want to remember that Israel fit into that. When Cyrus helped, the return of the Jews, when he helped building the temple and so forth, that may have been kind of standard procedure in that era. By that I mean that the Persian government respected, that is, they allowed the religion and the culture of those various units, those provinces, to exist. They didn't force the people to worship any particular god. They were allowed to worship their own gods. They were allowed some latitude in terms of cultural things. But of course, there was a military presence in each of those provinces. Now, in the book of Esther, think about what happened in the book of Esther there. Mordecai somehow got himself ingratiated to the government, and his niece Esther was part of that. I guess the harem, or it became part of the harem of the king, and eventually was appointed queen. Now, had she not been appointed queen, and had she and Mordecai not been able to convince the ruler Ahasuerus, who was removed from down the line from Cyrus, had she not been there in that providential position, would Jerusalem, and had the decree that Haman guy got the king to sign, got Ahasuerus to sign about eliminating the Jews, would Jerusalem have been affected? Esther was about 50 years removed from the building of the temple. Now, if the Jews were to be eradicated, as was the decree of Ahasuerus, the Persian king, would Jerusalem been affected? Would they have been exempt from that decree? No, they wouldn't have been exempt from it. And they probably, in that situation, they probably didn't have a military to protect themselves. So that would have, Jerusalem would have been affected had not, through the providence of God, Esther been situated as the queen. So there's a lot of context to this transition from the Babylonian Empire to the Persian Empire. Babylonian Empire lasted how many years? 70. The Persian Empire lasted for two centuries. And so that context may help us to understand a little more about what was going on here in the last part of chapter 5 and the first part of chapter 6 of this book. So in chapter 29, or chapter 5, verse 29, it reads, "Then commanded," now this is after the handwriting on the wall, you'll remember. The chapter, the chapter, or verse 29 reads, "Then commanded Belshazzar that they clothed Daniel." Remember, here Belshazzar it was revealed to Belshazzar what that handwriting on the wall, that is, Mene, Mene, Tekel-Upharsin, after Belshazzar, the Babylonian king, the last Babylonian king, understood what that meant, he clothed Daniel in purple, so to speak. He made him put a gold chain around his neck, made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now, Belshazzar and his father were kind of co-authorities. They kind of they shared the leadership. Now, Belshazzar's father was not in the. He was off doing other things, and Belshazzar was kind of running the kingdom. And so, the third ruler, that is, in the old Babylonian regime, would have been Belshazzar, his father, and the third ruler then would be Daniel. So when the Persians took over, there's Daniel already in the government. In that night, in verse 30, was Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, slain. And Darius the Mede took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Now, how did he take over? How did the Medes take over without a fight? Well, Cyrus diverted the Euphrates River. Now, the Euphrates River ran through Babylon, the city-state there, ran through there. This Babylonian empire was, it was thought to be impossible for anybody to invade that, because they had a moat around the wall. The walls were humongous. They had a moat around the walls, water in it, and the river running through the city. So how could you penetrate that city? And so while Cyrus he diverted the river, so what could happen now? Got some dry land. Go into the city on dry land. And the Babylonians were carousing. They had this big old feast and so forth. And Daniel's interpretation of Mene, Tekel-Upharsin was that, you're hanging in the balance and you're found wanted. You're done, man. It's over. And so it was over for the ruler in that very night. And so while these Babylonians, all the princes and all the authorities there that would gather together in that big feast that was a part of that handwriting on the wall, those people, they weren't thinking about anybody penetrating their city, and so they weren't in a position to put up a fight. And so Darius the Mede then took the kingdom, being about 32 years old. Okay, then.
Bill, before you
Yeah.
It's almost like Belshazzar didn't believe what he was hearing. Usually, when somebody brings bad news, they kill the messenger. And here, Daniel gave him the news, and then he still gives him dresses him in the purple and the fine robe.
Yeah. That brings up an interesting point there that here Daniel's giving the king bad news, and sometimes when bad news came by way of a messenger, they killed the messenger. Well, in this case, for whatever reason, and this is part of providence, I believe, probably one of the last official acts of the king of Babylon was to make him a third ruler in the kingdom. Now, apparently Darius, did Darius and Daniel ever have any interaction? Did Darius know anything about Daniel? I suppose the only thing he knew is that he was a high government official. And, it's interesting to me that, when we change governors, they generally get rid of all the bureaucracy, the bureaucrats within the government. When you transition from one president to another, get rid of all of the public officials that you can, all those that have any real influence on the direction of the government. Get rid of them. But in this case, there's Darius. We'll see that Darius then kept Daniel. And of course, promise of God figures into this whole equation. And so, chapter 6 then, we begin our discussion of Daniel in the lion's den and how that transpired. We all know the story, but there are some nuances here that we probably, some of us might not have thought about. So in chapter 6, it pleased Darius, and remember Cyrus was waiting in the wings to become ruler. There must have been some kind of agreement when the Medes and the Persians combined and went forward, capturing other countries. There must have been some kind of an agreement there about who would be the ruler. But Darius was a Mede, and Cyrus was of a different nationality. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 provinces, which should be over the whole kingdom. As I said before, the Medo-Persian Empire was more expansive than the Babylonian Empire. And he set up princes. He set up authorities in these 120 provinces, that they should be over the whole kingdom. Now, these folks, this kingdom, this Medo-Persian kingdom, was a very diverse kingdom. I mean, lots of different nationalities, lots of different countries, lots of different cultures, lots of different religious experience of those countries. So it would be hard to, with all that diversity, it'd be hard to maintain control. But he set up a government where, as I said before, there was a civil ruler, but then the Medo-Persian people had their military presence there. So if you don't have a military presence, I mean, if a country that doesn't have a military presence can't be a sovereign nation, right? You have to have, our Constitution says that the main role of government is what? National defense, right? That's the main in our. So, but if some other unit is in charge of the military, then you're in you just kind of do what you have to do to avoid military action against you. So he set up these people, these authorities in each country, the civil authorities, and then the military authorities were under the direct control of the king, the emperor, whatever you called him. Now, one of the functions, or probably the primary function of that civil authority, was to do what? Collect the taxes the tribute money that was sent off to the central government. Well, it's the same situation in the New Testament era when the Romans, taxed the Jews and taxed the other communities over which they had control. Verse 2, and over these 3 presidents, now of whom Daniel was first. Now think about that. Daniel had been in the government of Babylon, and now Darius, in setting up his government there, had all these authorities in these 120 provinces that reported to these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was first. For whatever reason, after Belshazzar appointed him, that is Daniel, to be the 3rd ruler, that Persian government carried that structure over. And over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was first, that the princes might give accounts unto them, the king should have no damage. Now, what does that mean? Well, these 3 people in the central government were to ensure that all of those civil rulers across this 120 province area would bring in the tribute money and not be rebellious. They were in charge of, checking out if there's going to be some rebellion and to get the tribute money and the tax money in, that the king should have no damage, that the king should be made whole, that the king should get his due from these various provinces. Then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes. Now, he had an excellent spirit, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. Now, what's that going to do? Here's a Jewish person, and the Jews had, I'm sure there was a lot of hatred for the Jews, just like in the book of Esther, where this Haman hated the Jews, hated Mordecai. There's a lot of prejudice against the Jews, I'm sure, in that era. And now this person is going to be at the head of these 3 rulers, in the central government. Set him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. There would have been a lot of buzz, wouldn't there? Among those people. The king's going to set this Jewish guy, going to set him above the rest of us. And so then these presidents and the princes. Now, who were the princes? They were the local authorities. Now, I suppose there was a lot of buzz about, we're not going to have this Hebrew, being over us in terms of authority. So they tried to find out. They tried to figure out if Daniel had in any way ever been disloyal to the king. Now, if they were disloyal to the king, then what? Well, then they'd have something. They'd have something on, and the king would then, punish Daniel. They couldn't. There was no. Daniel was. Now think about this. Daniel was totally committed to his God, right? He was totally committed to the king. Now, I don't know what the lesson there is, but it's kind of interesting. Totally committed to God, totally committed to civil government, or his king. And he was loyal to both. He was in a situation where he was loyal to both his God and his king. For as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. They couldn't find a single fault with Daniel in terms of his responsibility to the king. Then said these men, and then they involved some of the local authorities, those local princes. Verse 5, then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Then these presidents, now notice this, and princes assembled, a big herd of them, a big bevy of those ruling authorities at a lower level than Daniel. Then these presidents and the princes assembled together to the king and said thus unto him, King Darius, live forever. The presidents of the kingdom, the governors, now Lois said the governors, the princes, then the counselors, together to establish a royal statute. Now, they've got all the government, the VIPs in the government. They got them all together. They're all in one accord. And here's Daniel alone. So they come up with this clever idea. Do you suppose that can you think of where somebody in some government has connived against the president or connived against the authorities? You suppose that's ever happened? You suppose that's ever happened in our country? Where somebody within some minion of government has purposefully given bad advice to the ruling authority. Probably, it's not only probably, but that kind of thing happens. And so these people, they come up with a plan to con the king. Now, that's a pretty dangerous thing to do, because why is it pretty dangerous to do? Because there's a chance they're going to get caught, right? And if they get caught, it's not going to be good. Because the king is still the king. He's still the authority, okay? So all the presidents and the governors, and they had the local folks, the local authorities, the counselors, the inner circle of advisors to the king, had them all. They all, with one accord, they come up with this sinister plan. And so they're going to have the king establish a statute. And, we talk about nobody in our country is above the rule of law. Have you ever heard that? You hear it all the time. The president is not above the law. When Nixon got caught with some chicanery, our president in the past, and some of you don't even remember your history about President Nixon, when he was caught, and in that era, people respected the rule of law enough that his associates, I remember some people in Congress going to him and saying, the president you've got to resign. You're not above the law. We can't break this tradition of some people. We can't break the tradition that nobody is above the law. Everybody has to obey or be punished for it. Well, their decree was very clever. They convinced the king to establish a law, a law that couldn't be rescinded. And this law would be one of, and it would be put in law. It would be signed and sealed and be not changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. So they put this in writing, and what was this to do? If anybody worshipped anything or anybody or any deity other than the king for a 30-day period, they would be punished. Wherefore, in verse 9, King Darius signed the writing and the decree. Now, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, what did he do? Well, we all know what he did, but the review here is good. When Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into the house, his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day. And you can imagine the dissidents there, the people that were against him, they're spying on him. He didn't care. He knew that, and no doubt, he knew that they were, in fact, spying on him. And he prayed and gave thanks before God as he did aforetime. He was being thankful to the God of heaven, even in these circumstances. And then these men assembled and found Daniel praying. They had evidence now that he's going against the law of the Medes and the Persians. He's going against the law. He's violating the law that had been signed. Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. Verse 12, and then they came near and spake before the king concerning the king's decree. Now you can imagine these people that were clever, They came and said, King, well now, King, do you remember signing that law? Hast thou not signed a decree that every man that shall ask a petition of any god or man within 30 days, save of thee, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? That, I don't know whether that decree that he signed had that proclamation or that punishment of being put into the den of lions or not, whether that was actually in the decree, but that was apparently the intended consequences. But the king answered, said, the thing is true. So the king acknowledged, it's true, you're right. According to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. Then answered they and said, they didn't identify. Do you suppose if they had identified that Daniel's the guy, do you suppose the king would have written or would have signed that decree? Probably not. But Daniel was not mentioned when they got the king to sign the decree. Then answered they, verse 13, and said before the king, that Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah, regardeth not D. Now, that was a lie. He really did regard the king. O king, nor the decree that thou hast signed, but maketh his petition 3 times a day, that is, before his God, Jehovah God, the God of the Hebrews. Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself. Yeah, he was thinking, how have I been tricked? You know, if somebody tricks you, that doesn't feel so hot, does it? When you're tricked into something, you buy a lemon, who are you mad at? Are you mad at the lemon seller? Or are you mad at yourself? You know, how could I be so stupid? Don't you imagine the king was saying, how could I be so stupid to have done this? He says, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself. I ought to have known that those people were up to no good when they brought that petition to me, or that idea. You know, I should have known better. I should have been smarter. Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself and set his heart on Daniel. And you wonder how in that somewhat short period of time, apparently Daniel and the King Darius had some enough interaction that Daniel was a kind of a favorite. Daniel was respected by the king, so he's figured out, how can I get out of this? I can't violate the decree that I've signed, but how do I get out of this dilemma? And he's labored till the going down of the sun. He labored, no doubt they rushed into him in the morning to deliver this message, you know, that Daniel was violating the decree. And he labored all day. He tried all day to figure out some way, or some loophole in the law, some way of getting, saving Daniel. Then these men assembled unto the king and said unto the king, Know, O king, that the law of the Medes and the Persians is that no decree, no statute which the king established may be changed. Then the king commanded. Now, that was really an affront to the king. These people, they didn't need to remind the king that, that was the law. So the idea there is, I can imagine the king was really at this point upset. You don't need to tell me that what the situation is. And then the king commanded, and they brought Daniel, cast him into the den of the lions. Now, we know the rest of the story, but as I said before, there are some nuances here that really need to be kind of internalized, and we'll pick up there next 2 weeks from now. So 2 weeks from now, we're still going to be in the lion's den here.